There is a version of Avatar, The Last Airbender, that you have never seen. Not a remake, not a reimagining, the original, the one that existed in sketchbooks and pitch documents, and late-night conversations between two men who believed, with more certainty than they had any right to feel, that a cartoon about a 12-year-old monk could change what animated television was allowed to be. That version is different from the one you know. Not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, but different in the quiet ways that matter most. Different names, different characters, different paths through the same essential world. Different endings to stories that you spent years watching, loving, and eventually letting live inside you like something permanent. And then there are the stories that never made it at all. The season that was planned and then quietly set aside. The scenes that were storyboarded, reviewed, and then pulled before they could reach anyone's screen. The characters who almost existed in forms so different from the ones you know that they might as well be strangers. The redemption arc that was outlined, discussed, drafted in somebody's mind, and then left unfinished when the circumstances shifted and the window closed. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. Slowly, carefully. The way you walk through a place you have been told is beautiful, but have never visited yourself. This is not a list of complaints. This is not an argument that the show fell short. Avatar, The Last Airbender is, by almost any measure, one of the most complete, deliberate, and carefully crafted animated stories ever made for American television. What we are doing tonight is something different. We are holding the finished thing up to the light and looking at the outline of everything that was removed before it reached us. The shadows of unfinished stories. The quiet places where something was meant to be and then was not. Some of these things were removed for good reasons. Some of them were removed because time ran out, some because a network pushed back, and some because a single creator said no in a room and everyone agreed to move on. None of them disappeared entirely. They are still here, in interviews and commentary tracks and comic book sequels and posts made years after the fact by writers who still thought about them. They are here in the shape of the negative space they left behind, the moments in the show that feel like they are reaching towards something just out of frame, the questions that the story raises and then lets fall, the characters who end in places that feel like midpoints rather than conclusions. Let this be the sound that carries you towards sleep tonight. Not the absence of something good, but the abundance of care that surrounds it. The evidence of a world so full that even the parts that did not survive are worth visiting. Settle in. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders drop and your body sink into wherever you are resting. We have a long way to go, and all night to get there. If you are watching this from somewhere quiet tonight, drop a comment with your location and the time. There is something I genuinely love about knowing that different corners of the world are all letting the same story carry them to sleep at the same moment. And if you have not subscribed yet, it is free, and it keeps these long-form journeys coming. Part 1. The world that almost wasn't the unaired pilot and the show's true beginning. Before Avatar, The Last Airbender was a television series. It was a pitch. Before it was a pitch, it was a conversation. And before it was a conversation, it was two separate things that happened to two people at nearly the same time, and then collided in a way that neither of them could have planned. Brian Konietzko and Michael Dante DiMartino had known each other since the Rhode Island School of Design in the 1990s. Konietzko studied illustration. DiMartino studied animation. They shared an appetite for the kind of storytelling that American animation studios of that era had largely decided their audiences were too impatient to appreciate. Epic fantasy built across sustained arcs. Philosophically rich worlds with genuine internal consistency. The kind of narrative ambition that most American cartoon producers in the 1990s attributed exclusively to Japanese anime and considered essentially unreachable in their own medium. After graduating, both of them ended up in Los Angeles. DiMartino found work directing on Family Guy. Konietzko joined him there. They were good at their jobs, but they wanted to make something of their own, something that used the full range of what had drawn them to animation in the first place, something that did not apologize for its ambitions or compress them to fit a studio's existing template. The shape of what that something would eventually become arrived the way significant things often arrive. Not through a single dramatic inspiration, but through a quiet convergence of two ideas that happened to be in the same room at the same time. Konietzko had been drawing. He had taken an old sketch of a balding, middle-aged man and had begun pushing it in a new direction. He made the figure younger. He made him a child. He drew this bald child herding enormous bison through open sky, bison with arrow markings on their heads, bison so large their backs could carry passengers across vast distances. He showed the drawing to DiMartino. DiMartino, around that same period, had been watching a documentary about explorers trapped at the South Pole. Men surrounded by ice in every direction, cut off from the rest of the world, surviving against the enormous indifference of a landscape that did not care whether they made it. Something in that image had stayed with him. The isolation of it. The way the whiteness made everything feel both very small and very exposed. The two ideas went into the same conversation. Konietzko has described, in interviews marking the show's 20th anniversary, driving to DiMartino's house one night with the urgency of something clicking into place. No cell phones to call ahead. Just the need to get there and talk before the feeling passed. They talked through what the bald boy in the sky meant, and what the frozen landscape meant, and who might be inside the ice, and who might eventually find them. Very quickly, he has said, the essential architecture of a world began to take shape. In January 2002, they were given the green light by Nickelodeon's then head of development, Eric Coleman, to develop a series around action, adventure, legends, and lore. Those were the broad parameters. Within those parameters, Konietzko and DiMartino began constructing a world from scratch, which is what it sounds like when you say it plainly but is genuinely staggering when you consider what it required in practice. The 4 nations, each grounded in real cultural traditions. The 4 bending disciplines, each built around the philosophy and movement vocabulary of real martial arts. The Avatar cycle. The 100-Year War. The boy in the ice who had been there for the same 100 years without knowing it. All of it assembled, piece by piece, over approximately 3 years before a single episode aired. The first tangible artifact of that development was the unaired pilot. A pilot exists to answer a single question: does this deserve to be made? It is rough and provisional, and made under conditions that are not yet the conditions of the finished show. Avatar's unaired pilot was made with the Korean animation studio Tin House, which did not continue to work on the series. Its purpose was to convince Nickelodeon, through a tangible demonstration, that this world and these characters were worth the investment of a full season order. It accomplished that purpose. But the show depicted in the pilot is different from the show you know in several quiet, significant ways. The most immediately noticeable difference is in the opening sequence. The official opening begins with silhouetted figures demonstrating each bending style against a deep red backdrop. The waterbender moves in slow circular arcs, the motion communicating redirection rather than force. The earthbender's movements are low and stomping, projecting immovability. The firebender extends and strikes. The airbender circles and evades. Each figure demonstrates something not just about its element, but about the philosophy behind the element. The sequence is approximately 30 seconds long and communicates an enormous amount without a single word. The pilot's opening sequence is slower, arranged differently. The benders appear in their own national settings rather than against the unified red ground. The documentary quality of it, the sense of here is the world and here are its peoples, is informative rather than ceremonial. Both versions orient a new viewer to the basic premise. But the official opening feels like being inducted into something. The pilot's opening feels like being introduced to it. And then there is the name. In the unaired pilot, the character who will become Katara is named Kia. She is still a waterbender. She is still Sokka's sister. She is still the one whose action breaks Aang free from the ice and sets the entire story in motion. But she is Kia, not Katara. And the difference carries more weight than it might initially seem. Katara is a name that has, over 2 decades of the show's existence, become so thoroughly her name that it feels not chosen but discovered, the word the character was always going to arrive at. It has roots in words meaning droplet or pure across several languages. It sounds like water. It sounds like the specific kind of water that is precise and directed and purposeful. Kia is a different sound, lighter, less anchored. The name of a character who has not yet fully settled into herself. The name Kia does not disappear from the Avatar universe when Katara becomes Katara. In The Legend of Korra, Kia becomes the name of Katara and Aang's daughter. The name that did not fit the mother found a home in the child. It is the kind of creative recycling that the Avatar universe has always practiced, turning discarded material into continuity. Then there is the question of Aang's voice. In the official series, Aang is voiced by Zach Tyler Eisen, a child actor whose performance gave the character a texture so specific and so right that imagining anyone else in the role requires genuine effort. Eisen made Aang feel authentically 12 years old, in the way that actual 12-year-olds sometimes are, rather than the way animated children are usually performed as being. The playfulness was real. The occasional retreat into lightness when the weight of things became too much was real. And underneath all of it, the grief of the Last Airbender, rarely named and rarely confronted, sometimes glimpsed in the spaces between the jokes. In the unaired pilot, Aang is voiced by Mitchell Musso, known primarily for the Hannah Montana franchise. Musso is a capable voice actor. His performance in the pilot is energetic, boyish, hitting the right notes of playfulness and optimism. But there is something in the register that differs from what Eisen brought. The texture underneath the playfulness, the access to the grief, sits differently. The recasting between pilot and series was one of the most consequential decisions made in that transition. It shaped every scene of the finished show. And then there is the absence where Iroh should be. In the official series, Zuko travels with his uncle Iroh. This relationship is the emotional spine of the series, not the central plot, which belongs to Aang, but the structural element that holds everything upright, the evidence that the story believes in Zuko's redemption even before Zuko can believe in it himself. Iroh is the person who loves Zuko without conditions, who models a different kind of strength, who demonstrates through daily example that wisdom and warmth and the willingness to sit with someone in their darkness are not weakness, but the highest form of strength available. In the unaired pilot, Iroh is not there. Instead, Zuko travels with a messenger hawk. The hawk is functional. It delivers communications. It probably seemed in early development like a reasonable solution to the question of who Zuko talks to when he is not actively in pursuit of Aang. But the hawk cannot do what Iroh does. It cannot sit beside Zuko in every wrong turn and every proud refusal and model, through patient example, what it looks like to choose differently. It cannot make tea in a prison cell and make the act of making tea feel like a philosophical act. It cannot tell Zuko, simply and without elaboration, in a voice that makes the words land like something enormous, that it is proud of its nephew. When Mako Iwamatsu was cast as Iroh and began recording his performance, something was established that changed the show's emotional architecture entirely. Mako brought a warmth to the role that cannot be described in technical terms because it is not technique. It is the warmth of someone who has been somewhere real and emerged from it carrying the knowledge of what it cost. The hawk could not do this. Remove Iroh from the story and you remove the engine of Zuko's redemption, the mechanism that makes his change feel not just possible but inevitable. The pilot's structural difference from the official first episode is one more thing worth sitting with. The official first episode begins at the South Pole, with Katara and Sokka, with the specific cold quietness of a world at uneasy peace, with a stillness that makes the disruption of Aang's arrival and Zuko's arrival shortly after feel meaningful because you have been given something to protect before you are given something to fight. The pilot begins with Zuko, already in pursuit. The chase is already underway. The stillness is never established. What you lose in not having the stillness is the sense of scale, the feeling of a world at rest that makes its disturbance something genuinely significant. The unaired pilot was never aired on television. For years, it existed only on DVD. Since 2020, Nickelodeon has made it more broadly available. And the comparison between the pilot and the official first episode is one of the most instructive documents in the show's history. What it shows, more than anything specific, is how much of Avatar's identity was still being found when the first frames were being drawn. The essential idea was present: the bald boy, the ice, the war, but the texture had not yet assembled itself. The world that almost wasn't became the world that is, and the distance between them is the measure of everything the show chose on the long road from that first sweaty late-night conversation to the 61 hours of television that changed what American animation was allowed to be. Part 2. The characters who nearly never existed, early designs, changed identities, and the long road to Toph. There is a version of Toph Beifong who is a teenage boy. That statement requires sitting with for a moment because it sounds wrong. The way something sounds wrong when it contradicts something that has come to feel inevitable. Toph is so specifically herself, so thoroughly the character she became, that imagining her as anything else feels like imagining water that runs uphill. But it is true, documented in the creator's own words across multiple interviews and podcast appearances, and spending time with the history of how she came to exist, changes the way you see not just Toph but the entire second season and everything the second season built toward. The character who would eventually become Toph was conceived during the development of Avatar's second book. The story needed an earthbending teacher for Aang. The teacher had to be a master of the discipline, someone who could push Aang in ways that Katara and Sokka could not, someone whose approach to earthbending was fundamentally different from Aang's airbending-influenced instincts, and would force him to encounter the element on its own terms. The thinking that went into the teacher's identity followed a logic that made immediate intuitive sense. Earthbending is the most physically dominant of the four disciplines. Its movements are low, rooted, powerful in the way that large, heavy things are powerful. Its practitioners communicate strength through sheer visible mass. The early concept for Aang's earthbending teacher reflected this directly. The character was designed as a muscular teenage boy, broad, athletic, the kind of physical presence that projects formidability before the character has done anything, that lets an audience understand immediately and without ambiguity that this person can do what the story requires them to do. According to the creators, this male version of the character was also conceived with a role in the group dynamics. He was meant as a foil for Sokka, a kind of physical jock counterpart to Sokka's more strategically cerebral personality. There was even a concept of a love triangle between this male earthbending character Aang and Katara, adding a layer of romantic competition to the core group. The shift away from all of this came from Aaron Ehasz, the show's head writer. He put an observation into the room during a writing session that began somewhere between a suggestion and a joke. The image he described was this: what if the greatest earthbender in the world was a small blind girl? What if the most physically dominant bending discipline, the one defined by weight and immovability and rooted physical power, was practiced at the highest level by someone who looked, on the surface, like the least likely candidate for any of those qualities? A girl. Young, small, blind, someone who would be underestimated by every person who encountered her before they learned, usually immediately and in a way that was memorable and occasionally structural in its consequences, that they had been comprehensively wrong. The observation stopped being a joke almost immediately. What Ehasz had articulated was not a subversion for its own sake. It was the show's deepest thematic instinct applied to a character design. Avatar had been built, from its earliest development, around the gap between appearance and reality. Zuko looks like a villain and is in the process of becoming something else. Iroh looks like a foolish old man pursuing small pleasures and is one of the most profound people in the show's world. The Fire Nation presents itself as bringing civilization while conducting genocide. A small blind girl who is the most powerful earthbender alive is not a trick or a gimmick. It is the show's most fundamental observation, the one that runs underneath all its other observations, expressed through a character design. Brian Konietzko initially resisted the idea. His instinct was that the massive, athletic teenage boy made more visual sense as a master earthbender, that the power of the discipline needed to be communicated through physical presence rather than subverted by its absence. He pushed back. He made the case for the original design. He held his position for a while. The room won him over. And shortly after Toph became female, became 12 years old, became small and seemingly unimposing, became blind, became the specific impossible person she ended up being, Konietzko has said publicly that she became his favorite character in the entire series. He notes this with evident amusement, the irony of it. The character he fought against became the character he loves most. The creative position he was wrong about produced the result he is most attached to. Then there was a second fight, this one between the production and the network. Once Konietzko and DiMartino had committed to making the earthbending master female, Nickelodeon had concerns. The concerns, as Konietzko has described them in podcast appearances on Avatar, Braving the Elements, centered on the network's discomfort with a female character who was physically dominant, rough-edged, aggressively uninterested in conventional approachability, and entirely unwilling to perform the kind of softened femininity that the network was more familiar with accommodating. Toph's early character outline did not look like anything in Nickelodeon's existing library. She was too stubborn, too physical, too blunt. She did not soften herself for anyone's comfort. The network worried she would not connect with audiences. The creators held their ground. They argued for this specific character in this specific form. They did not compromise the edges that made her what she was. And eventually they won, the way people who care deeply about a specific, creative choice sometimes win these arguments. not in a single triumphant moment, but through sustained, clear-eyed, patient advocacy for the choice they knew was right. What came out the other side of that fight is one of the most beloved animated characters in the history of American television. Viewers who were children when the show aired have carried Toph Beifong into their adult lives with a specificity that reveals something real. She was, for many of them, the first time a female character in their viewing experience did not qualify herself, did not apologize for her power or her roughness or her refusal to be accommodating. She simply was, completely and without editorial comment. And the show never once suggested there was anything about that which required correction. Nickelodeon, which fought against having her in the first place, now sells Toph merchandise. The original male Toph design was not discarded when Toph became Toph. It was recycled several times across the finished series in ways that the show's devoted fan base eventually documented. The broad-shouldered earthbender silhouetted in the show's opening credits uses elements of the original male design. The character Sood, Avatar Roku's earthbending instructor seen in Book 3 flashbacks, draws from it. And then there is the Ember Island Players, in which the theatrical troupe's play about the group's adventures includes a large, burly adult male actor playing Toph on stage. The in-world joke is that the play got everything wrong. The actual joke, visible only to viewers who know the design history, is that the large male earthbender playing Toph is essentially the character that Toph almost was. It is the show looking back at its own development history and finding it worth a gentle laugh. The design elements that did not fit into Toph also traveled forward into the franchise's future. When The Legend of Korra was developed, Bolin, one of that series' central characters, absorbed much of the physical energy, comedic personality, and earthbending style that had originally been imagined for a male Toph. The abandoned concept found a new home, transformed by context into something that worked beautifully. Then there is Azula. Azula, as she exists in the show, is female. Her gender is so thoroughly integrated into how her character functions, into the specific ways her relationship with her father's expectations and her brother's competing journey and her mother's withheld warmth operate, that imagining her as anything else requires real effort. Her arc is inseparable from the particular kind of damage that comes from being told you are perfect by someone who is incapable of love, from being given power as a substitute for warmth, from performing excellence so consistently that you lose access to any experience of being less than excellent. But early in the show's development, Azula was also conceived as male. The working name was Azul, drawn directly from the Spanish word for blue, the color already chosen as the signature of her fire. This was before the full shape of the Fire Nation royal family had been worked out, before the resonance between Azula's story and Zuko's story had been understood as one of the show's central structural elements. Making the character female created a sibling dynamic that became one of the most psychologically rich elements in the entire series. A brother and a sister, both children of the same monstrous father, each responding to the identical set of conditions in almost perfectly inverted ways. Zuko turning his father's coldness into a wound he cannot stop touching, a source of shame that drives him toward impossible proving. Azula absorbing that coldness into her identity, becoming the weapon her father wanted until she can no longer distinguish between what she is and what she was shaped into, until the performance of perfection begins to crack the performer from the inside. That dynamic, with all of its depth and its tragedy, required both characters to be exactly what they are. A male Azula and a male Toph, and an Iroh replaced by a hawk and a Katara named Kia. These are not small differences. They are the show before it knew what it was. The show before the specific rightness of its final form had been discovered through the slow process of finding it. Part 3. The season that was nearly canceled, the fight between books 2 and 3. Most viewers who love Avatar, The Last Airbender, experience it as a complete thing. 3 seasons, 61 episodes, an ending that feels so carefully prepared for and arrived at that it is almost difficult to believe it required any luck. It feels designed. It feels like the people who made it knew exactly where they were going and were trusted to go there unobstructed. The reality was considerably more fragile than that impression suggests. Aaron Ehaus, who served as head writer across the series and shaped many of its most important episodes, has spoken in interviews about working on a show that was never fully guaranteed to continue. Avatar's production is not the story of a network that believed in the show from the beginning. It is the story of a show that had to prove itself, at almost every stage, to an institution that was not entirely certain what it had. When Konietzko and DiMartino first pitched to Nickelodeon, they did not receive a full season order. They received a commission for 5 scripts. Ihas has described his initial role as making those 5 scripts strong enough to justify ordering more. The show had to demonstrate its potential before it could develop it. Even after the 5 scripts succeeded, the initial order was for 13 episodes, not the full 20 that constituted Book 1's complete run. The production's response to this constraint reveals something essential about how Avatar was built. If you have only 13 episodes and do not know if you will get more, you put something extraordinary at episode 13. Something so good, so specifically demonstrating of what the show can do at its highest capacity, that leaving the story unfinished becomes genuinely difficult to justify to any reasonable observer. Episode 13 of Book 1 is The Blue Spirit. In any honest ranking of the series' finest episodes, it places near the top. It strips away the supporting cast entirely. It puts Aang and Zuko alone in the same story for an extended period, removes the structure of their standard dynamic, and for a sustained stretch shows them something closer to themselves in relation to each other. Zuko, behind the blue spirit mask, rescues Aang not from compassion but from strategy. Yet the act happens. And in its aftermath, Aang asks Zuko a question that the show spends the next 2 seasons answering. If they had met under different circumstances, could they have been friends? The question is ended by Zuko revealing himself. The almost connection is interrupted, but the question stays in the air across every subsequent episode of their antagonism. It stays because the blue spirit made it feel, for its entire runtime, genuinely possible that the answer could be yes. The episode existed at episode 13, partly because the production needed the network to order more. It served, alongside its enormous other qualities, as proof of concept for the show's greatest strength, its ability to make you feel the full weight of a relationship that has not yet been allowed to become itself. It worked. The full first season was ordered. Book 1 ended with The Siege of the North, which accomplished the same task at even larger scale. A 2-part finale that operates simultaneously as a battle sequence, a spiritual event, a character study, and a meditation on the relationship between human choices and cosmic forces. Extraordinary television on every level. And also, in the show's ongoing conversation with the network, another demonstration of what it could do when allowed to reach. Between the end of Book 2 and the beginning of full production on Book 3, there was a period of real uncertainty. Ihas has confirmed in various interviews that Avatar was, for a time between those seasons, technically in a cancelled state, not formally announced as ended, not publicly declared finished, but not renewed either. The production was suspended, the story left hanging in institutional indecision that would have been, had it held, one of the most significant failures of judgment in the history of American network animation. A serialized story that had been building across 2 seasons, that had ended Book 2 on Aang's death and Zuko's devastating choice to side with Azula, left permanently unresolved. The consequences of this uncertainty are visible in Book 3's shape. It is the tightest and most propulsive of the 3 seasons, the least inclined to linger in the ways that Books 1 and 2 sometimes lingered. Book 3 moves with urgency. It does not pause unless the pause serves the momentum. This is not a flaw. Book 3 contains some of the finest television Avatar ever produced. Zuko alone is perhaps the most formally ambitious episode in the entire run, a nearly wordless portrait of Zuko in exile that conveys more psychological depth per frame than most feature films manage in their full runtime. The Day of Black Sun achieves something close to genuine war movie filmmaking within the constraints of animated children's television. The finale is 92 minutes of sustained intensity that holds together in a way that serialized storytelling rarely manages. But there is also, underneath all of that quality, the quality of something slightly accelerated, slightly aware that it cannot count on unlimited time and must reach the ending before the door closes. The breathing room that could have been Book 3's, if it had been made with the security of a show that knew it would be allowed to finish, is slightly contracted, present in places, absent in others. The mark of people writing urgently, people who loved what they were building too much to risk it being interrupted. Nickelodeon renewed the show. The ending was made. But the show that made that ending was a show that had spent 3 years proving it deserved to exist, one high-stakes demonstration at a time, always aware that the proof might not be enough. That awareness shaped the finished product in ways that are real and worth acknowledging, not as weakness but as context. Book 3 is a masterwork of urgent storytelling made by people fighting to reach a conclusion before the door they were making it through could close. The fact that they made it through is the miracle. The fact that what they made in those conditions is as extraordinary as it is the evidence of what genuine creative commitment looks like when the stakes are real. Part 4. The season that was never made. Aaron Ehaus's vision for Book 4. In April 2019, on the 1st of April, Aaron Ehaus posted a thread on social media that sent genuine ripples through the Avatar fan community. He was careful to note it was not a joke. He had served as head writer on Avatar: The Last Airbender. He had shaped some of the show's most significant character decisions, and he had something to say about a story that was never told. The center of what he described is Azula. By the end of Book 3, Azula has been brought somewhere the show does not shy away from depicting in full. The final Agni Kai between her and Zuko is one of the most deliberately unusual sequences in the entire run of the series. The camera pulls back to a distance that feels more like observation than coverage. The music shifts away from combat scoring to something closer to mourning. The pacing slows to a beat that is measured and deliberate rather than kinetic. The fight is shown in wide shots, the camera maintaining a distance that feels almost respectful, the way you hold back from approaching a tragedy that is happening in a place where your approach would be a violation. What unfolds is not a victory. The show knows it is not a victory and films it accordingly. Azula's fire, always before controlled and electric and coldly blue, becomes erratic. Bolts of it fly wild, strike the stone around her without apparent direction, spiral in patterns that communicate not power but the absence of the control that used to be its delivery mechanism. The fire is falling apart because she is falling apart. And the animation does not look away from this. At the end of it, after Katara has frozen Azula in place following Zuko's injury, Azula is in chains, and she is crying. The crying is not a performance. It is not a tactic. It is not the kind of tears Azula has always been able to deploy when they served a purpose. It is simply a person who has run out of every defense she built over years of relentless performance, who is no longer able to hold up the weight of what she is, who has arrived at the bottom and found it is further down than she thought the bottom was. The fire still comes. Wild. Directionless. The tears run down a face that has not let them out in front of another person in years, possibly ever. The show made this sequence with tremendous care and precision, and the care is visible in every frame. In the choice of camera angle, in the choice of music, in the specific way the fire moves when it is no longer controlled by someone who is controlling herself. Aaron Ehaus wrote, publicly and with evident feeling, that he always intended for Azula to have a redemption arc. He was specific. It would have been longer and far more complicated than Zuko's redemption arc, which is itself one of the most carefully constructed character journeys in animated television history. Longer, more complicated, further to go. The shape he described is this. Azula would have reached her absolute lowest point, somewhere below even where the finale leaves her, deeper than the chains and the wildfire. And in that bottommost moment she would have found Zuko. Not the Zuko of the early seasons, the one burning with need for his father's recognition, the one who could not yet find the thing in himself worth finding. The Zuko who had come through all of that, who had learned, through years of Iroh's patient, unreserved presence, what it means to be beside someone without conditions, what it means to believe in a better version of someone who has not yet given you any reason to believe it. The parallel Ehaus described is direct and deliberate. Iroh did not wait for Zuko to deserve love before he gave it. He sat with Zuko in his worst moments and did not go anywhere. He made tea. He told stories. He was present, steadily and without resentment, through every rejection and betrayal and proud refusal. And eventually that presence made it possible for Zuko to imagine a version of himself worth being present with. Ehaus wanted Zuko to do for Azula what Iroh had done for him, to be the person who does not leave, to believe in someone's better self before that better self has given him any reason to believe in it. Patient, forgiving, unconditionally present with the sister who had betrayed him and the world. He wrote that Zuko would have been by her side in her deepest moment. That the strength he gained from Iroh, patience and forgiveness, and the capacity to love without requiring the other person to deserve it yet, would have been what he brought to her. This story did not happen in animation. The graphic novels that continued the canon following the show's end took Azula's story in other directions, real and complicated and not tidily resolved, but not toward this specific shape, not toward Zuko as her anchor. The fourth season framework Ehas described would also have included Iroh and the spirit world. Iroh had spent decades developing a relationship with spiritual dimensions of the Avatar world that no other living Fire Nation citizen had cultivated. His ability to move within the spirit world was glimpsed in the series but never fully explored. What a story set primarily in that space, with Iroh as its guide and its center, might have looked like is one of the more genuinely fascinating questions raised by the Almost season. And then there is the thread that is most haunting. A child who might be the reincarnation of monk Gyatso. Gyatso, Aang's mentor at the Southern Air Temple, exists in the show almost entirely in memory and in the devastating evidence of his death. His skeleton, surrounded by the remains of Fire Nation soldiers in the temple where he died defending people he could not save, is one of the most powerful images in the series. The episode The Southern Air Temple does not explain the image. It shows it and then shows Aang's face and trusts the audience to do the rest. In Aang's memories, Gyatso is the one who loved him without the qualification of what he was supposed to be. He bent rules to let Aang keep Momo. He argued against the monk's plan to separate Aang from his home, understanding that the isolation they intended as preparation would function instead as damage. He saw the child rather than the role. The concept of a child appearing somewhere in the world who might carry some echo of Gyatso's consciousness is not a violation of the show's established spiritual logic. The Avatar cycle is built on the premise that consciousness persists across lives, that identity is not destroyed by death but finds new form. If the Avatar's consciousness moves through cycles of rebirth, there is no reason the show's cosmology provides why other significant spiritual presences could not do something analogous. And Aang encountering someone who might be Gyatso returned, while still carrying the grief of the temple and everything in it, is almost unbearable in its emotional implications. The reasons the fourth season was not made do not have a single clean answer. Ehas has pointed toward the focus shifting to the live-action film adaptation directed by M. Night Shyamalan, arguing that the production moved its attention away from the animated series in order to support that project. Konietzko and DiMartino have said they always planned 3 seasons and stand by their ending as the one they intended from the beginning. Shyamalan himself, in an interesting footnote to the history, reportedly encouraged the creators to produce a 4th animated season rather than focusing entirely on the film. The film was released in 2010. It was among the most critically dismissed theatrical releases of that decade, bearing almost no meaningful relationship to the series that inspired it. Many viewers have noted, with varying degrees of feeling, that the time spent on it might have been better spent on the animated continuation Ehas had outlined. This is the kind of counterfactual that cannot be answered. It can only be felt. What is not in dispute is what was left behind. Azula in chains, crying, her fire gone wild. Iroh in the spirit world, unexplored. A child somewhere who might carry the memory of a dead monk. The outline of a story about aftermath and repair, about whether the people who cause the most damage can be returned to themselves, and what it costs the people who try to bring them back. That outline still exists. It lives in the specific tragedy of the finale's last image of Azula, in the deliberate openness of where she ends, in the care with which the final Agni Kai was filmed, a care that feels designed to leave a door open rather than close one. Part 5. The scene they storyboarded, and then killed Ursa's missing reunion. At the very end of Avatar, The Last Airbender, Zuko goes to see his father in prison. Ozai is defeated. His firebending is gone, taken by Aang's energy bending. He sits in a cell, and Zuko stands before him, and the power between them is completely and permanently reversed. Zuko holds Fire Lord now. He arrived there by becoming precisely the kind of person his father spent years trying to prevent him from being. The irony is total, and the show lets it sit without commentary. And Zuko asks a question. Where is his mother? Ozai's answer happens in the cut. The camera moves on. The scene ends without resolution. And Ursa's name, the question of where she is and what became of her, is left in the air where it will remain for years. Michael Dante DiMartino acknowledged this in the audio commentary for the finale. He said, simply, that he would take full responsibility for everyone who was upset about not knowing what happened to Ursa. The acknowledgement was candid, almost rueful. He knew what he was leaving open. He made the choice to leave it open anyway. What most viewers did not know at the time, and what came to light at a Comic-Con panel in 2008, is that an answer had been written. The reunion between Zuko and his mother had been storyboarded. Director Joaquim dos Santos confirmed that the scene existed in storyboard form before co-creator DiMartino made the call to remove it. Someone had drawn the composition of that moment. The camera angle, the expression on Zuko's face when he saw her again. It existed as a complete sequence of drawings, rendered and reviewed, before the decision was made that it could not go in. The decision was creative rather than logistical. There was, technically, room in the finale to include the scene. The reason it was removed was that the story of Ursa was too significant to be handled in the compressed, rushed way that a finale already full of other resolutions could offer. DiMartino's judgment was that doing it briefly and inadequately would be worse than not doing it at all. That the moment deserved more space than was available. That the open question was more honest than a closed but insufficient answer. This was, by most reasonable assessments, the right call. The instinct to protect a significant story beat from being diminished by insufficient context is a sound creative instinct. And the open question that remained, Zuko asking in a prison cell and the camera cutting away, has a weight that a rushed resolution could not have achieved. But the cost was a 5-year silence. From 2008 to 2013, Ursa remained gone. Zuko's question remained open. Everyone who watched the finale that July night in 2008 walked away from it without an answer. The story was eventually told in the graphic novel trilogy called The Search, written by Jean Luen Yang, published by Dark Horse Comics in 2013, with heavy involvement from both Konietzko and DiMartino. It is not a comfortable story. It does not offer easy closure. Ursa, The Search reveals, was a descendant of Avatar Roku. Her lineage made her politically significant, and she was essentially selected and pressed into marriage with Ozai as part of a dynastic arrangement. From the beginning of the marriage, she was isolated. Ozai made explicit that she was his property, and he installed servants whose loyalties ran to him. She was severed from her family and her home village. When Ozai planned to kill young Zuko in order to simplify the line of succession, Ursa made a bargain. She would give him something he wanted, something terrible, and in exchange Zuko would live. The thing she gave him was a poison, which Ozai used against Azulon. And then she was banished, warned that returning would mean her execution, and she left her children in the night. She went back to Hira'a, her home village. She found Ikem, her first love, still there. She found a path forward, and eventually, unable to bear the grief of what she had left behind, she sought out a spirit called the Mother of Faces. She asked for not just a new face but a new mind. The erasure of memory, the forgetting of her children along with everything else. The Mother of Faces granted it. Ursa became Noriko, a woman with no past, who lived quietly in Hira'a and had a daughter named Kiyi, who had no idea she had once been a mother to a Fire Lord. This is the story the storyboarded scene was reaching toward, the full weight of it, the sacrifice and the erasure and the tragedy of love that had to be forgotten in order to survive itself, could not have fit in the finale's final minutes. DiMartino was right. But the rightness of it cost everyone watching that night 5 years of waiting, and the people who never found the graphic novels are still waiting. Ursa's absence in the animated show has a particular texture. She appears in Zuko's memories, always warm, always reaching toward him in exactly the moments before he needed her most. Her love in those flashbacks is unconditional in the specific, exhausting way that unconditional love is exhausting. It does not protect the person you love from being hurt, it just means you love them anyway. Her absence from his life after her banishment is the wound that Iroh's love addressed without being able to fully heal. The storyboard is gone from the show. The question lives in the prison cell. Ursa lives in the graphic novels, remembered, restored, returned, and the scene that was drawn and then pulled is somewhere in a production archive, in the dark with everything else that almost happened. Part 6. The deaths they couldn't show yet, network restrictions, and the art of implying the unshowable. In the world of Avatar, The Last Airbender, people die. The show is set during a 100-year war. The consequences of violence are real and accumulate across 3 seasons. The Fire Nation's campaign against the air nomads is genocide. The systematic elimination of Southern Water Tribe benders is extermination. The war has been consuming lives for a century before Aang woke up in the ice. And yet the show aired on a children's network with content guidelines that specifically limited what could be depicted on screen around death and its visualization. The result is a series of departure scenes scattered across 3 seasons that are, individually and collectively, among the most inventive in American animation history. Not despite the restrictions, but because of them. The restrictions created creative problems that demanded creative solutions, and the solutions, in several cases, arrived at something more affecting than direct depiction would have been. The most famous of these is Jet. Jet arrives in Book 1 as charismatic, morally complicated, dangerous in the way that people who have replaced their childhood with a cause are dangerous. A boy orphaned by the Fire Nation who has transformed grief into mission and mission into identity. His first arc ends with the revelation that he is willing to flood a civilian village to strike at Fire Nation soldiers. Team Avatar stops him. He is not a cartoon villain. He is a child who has been given weapons and ideology instead of a childhood and does not yet understand the difference between fighting for people and using them as justification for the fighting. He returns in Book 2, apparently changed, presenting as reformed, forming an alliance with Team Avatar in Ba Sing Se. And then Long Feng, who controls the city through the Dai Li and through the systematic suppression of any acknowledgement that a war is happening outside the walls, subjects Jet to brainwashing. The same techniques, based on documented historical methods of coercive persuasion, that the Dai Li use to maintain the population's enforced ignorance. When Aang reaches Jet through the conditioning and Jet breaks free, he turns to fight Long Feng. Long Feng earthbends him into a wall with devastating force. The show deliberately does not show the impact landing. The blow begins and then Jet is on the ground. Katara tries to heal him. Her healing has no visible effect, which for a healer of Katara's demonstrated skill carries enormous weight. Jet tells them he will be fine. Toph, who cannot be lied to because she detects deception through involuntary physiological responses, tells Sokka as they walk away, he is lying. That is the last time Jet appears in the animated series. The sequence is constructed entirely from information designed to communicate a conclusion without depicting it. No one says the word. The audience is not shown anything explicitly, but every element of the sequence, the useless healing, the false comfort, the lie detector confirmation, is placed to make the conclusion inescapable if you are paying attention. The confirmation came in DVD special features rather than in the broadcast, where the creators stated plainly that Jet is dead. The Ember Island Players episode in Book 3 then addressed the ambiguity with remarkable directness. The actor playing Jet in the play says he will be fine while lying motionless on stage, and Sokka observes, "Did Jet just die?" And someone responds, "It was really unclear." That exchange is both funny and slightly more than funny. The show is acknowledging, through comedy, that the restrictions placed on it produced an outcome that confused its own audience. The creators could not say directly in the broadcast what had happened, so they put the confusion into the story itself. Let the characters voice what viewers had been asking for a season. Made the confusion both the punchline and the admission that a punchline was necessary, because something outside the story's control had required it. Zhao, the Fire Nation commander who kills the Moon Spirit in the Siege of the North, receives a different kind of departure. The Ocean Spirit, merged with Aang, reaches for him in the water as Fire Nation soldiers try and fail to pull him away. His hand reaches upward. The hands reaching toward it cannot reach far enough. He disappears below the surface. The camera does not follow. The show is permitted this because the agent of Zhao's departure is a spirit rather than a human being, which placed the moment in a category the network was less restrictive about. The spiritual framing created latitude that a human opponent would not have provided. Yu, the Northern Water Tribe princess who carries the Moon Spirit's life force within her since infancy, departs through transformation. She glows. She rises. She becomes something that continues in a different form. Her body remains empty in the specific, peaceful way that is unmistakably departure rather than sleep. The show gives her end full emotional weight because it is framed as sacrifice and transformation, as a choice rather than a loss inflicted from outside. The grief that follows is devastating, but it arrives through implication and beauty, through what the sacrifice made possible rather than through anything the network could classify as inappropriate content. And the Air Nomad genocide, the largest death toll in the show's history and the one with the most lasting consequences, is never depicted at all. It happened 100 years before the events of the series. What is shown are its results: empty temples, ancient bones, and Aang's face when he understands what the absence of other airbenders means. The episode, The Southern Air Temple, achieves its emotional weight entirely through absence. There are no attack scenes, no fire, no soldiers in that episode. There is a skeleton surrounded by the evidence of a last stand and a boy who understands what he is looking at. The restrictions were real, the losses they created were real, and the creativity they provoked, the inventiveness of finding another way to say the true thing when the direct route is blocked, produced storytelling that is genuinely remarkable and that, in several cases, is more affecting for being indirect than it would have been if shown plainly. Part 7. The Lost Episode Stories Between the Frames and the Great Divide Problem. Not every lost story in Avatar's history is a grand, cancelled arc. Some are smaller. They are episodes that existed in early plans and were cut from the broadcast order before production. Scenes that were written and then removed before animation began. Ideas that got as far as the writer's room table before being set aside in favor of something the production was more confident in. And then there is The Great Divide. Book 1, Episode 11. The Great Divide is the episode the show itself eventually made fun of. A self-contained story about two feuding groups crossing a dangerous canyon, with a moral resolution more convenient and less emotionally complex than the show's established standard. It feels like an episode from a different, lighter version of Avatar, one that is satisfied with simpler frameworks and cleaner resolutions, grafted into a season that had demonstrated, repeatedly, that it was operating at a higher level. The creators acknowledged this in various ways over the years. In the audio commentary for the series, in interviews where they were asked directly about the weakest episode and answered with the candid honesty of people who were not interested in defending something that did not meet their own standards. And then the Ember Island players in Book 3 turned the acknowledgement into something characteristically clever. In the fictional play the group watches about their own adventures, the journey through the Great Divide is skipped entirely. The actors on stage say simply, "Let us skip over the Great Divide." The audience watching the play cheers. That joke, with all its precision, is the show acknowledging its own failure through the story itself. Not from a comfortable external perspective, but from inside the narrative, using the meta-theatrical device of the play to say, "We know, and we know that you know," and the knowing is better addressed honestly than pretended away. What The Great Divide reveals about the production process is that the show operated under real constraints of episode order and production schedule that sometimes resulted in content that fell below the standard the rest of the series was setting for itself. Not every episode could be The Storm. Not every episode could be The Blue Spirit or Zuko Alone or The Tales of Ba Sing Se. Some episodes existed to fill a slot, to move the characters from one location to another, to provide breathing room between more demanding sequences. The Great Divide is the most visible casualty of this reality. On the other end are the stories that the show wanted to tell and simply could not fit. Some of these found their way into other forms. The graphic novel anthology The Lost Adventures, published by Dark Horse Comics in 2011, collects short stories from Nickelodeon Magazine and DVD releases between 2005 and 2011. The stories are explicitly in continuity with the animated series. Many of the writers and artists involved had also worked on the animated show. The stories depict events that occurred in the world between episodes, in the spaces between scenes, in the hours and days that the broadcast format could not accommodate. The existence of this anthology is an admission of something the show implies throughout. The world of Avatar was generating more story than could be contained in 61 episodes. Characters had lives outside what the camera followed. Events happened between episodes. The Lost Adventures exists because that overflow was real and deserved documentation even if it could not be animated. The Book 2 premiere, The Avatar State, planted a stake that the show had to carry for 2 full seasons. If Aang dies while in the Avatar State, the entire Avatar cycle ends permanently. This is the exact stake that makes the Book 2 finale devastating. Azula's lightning kills Aang while he is in the Avatar State. The chain should be broken. Katara's spirit water reverses it, but only just. The sequence in which this happens, the stillness of it, the absence of breath, Zuko's face as he registers what Azula has done, is one of the show's most genuinely shocking moments, precisely because the consequence was established a full season earlier, and the audience carried it with them across every subsequent episode. Carrying a piece of world-building that significant across that much narrative distance, trusting the audience to remember it, trusting the story to make use of it at the right moment, was a risk. The payoff earned it, but the risk was real. What the development history of Avatar shows across all these examples is a production that was always generating more story than it could tell, operating under constraints that demanded constant creative problem-solving, maintaining a level of narrative coherence across 3 seasons that is genuinely unusual for serialized animation. The lost stories are evidence of abundance rather than failure. There was always more world than could fit in the show. The question was always which parts of the world would make it through. Part 8. The bending arts that almost weren't metal bending, energy bending, and the system that built itself. Toph's invention of metal bending, introduced in Book 2's Bitter Work, is one of the most satisfying moments in the series from a world-building standpoint. The logic is elegant. Metal is processed earth, refined to remove most of its original mineral content, but not all of it. Trace impurities remain in any processed metal. A sufficiently sensitive earthbender, one whose perception of Earth's presence is refined to the degree that Toph's seismic sense has achieved, can detect those trace impurities and work through them. The show treats this as genuinely new. No other earthbender can do it. It did not exist before Toph figured it out, and she figures it out while trapped in a metal cage, with Aang's life potentially dependent on her getting free, under pressure that condenses what might otherwise take years of conceptual exploration into a single, urgent moment of necessity. What is less commonly known is that metal bending was not part of the original conception of the series. It was developed during production, as the writers followed the established logic of the bending disciplines to its implications. This is how the bending system grew across 3 seasons. Not from a complete document drafted before the first episode aired, but from a process of extrapolation, of asking what follows from what we have already established, of following the internal rules of the world to wherever they lead. Each new bending development in the show is reachable from what came before it. Bloodbending extends the water-bending principle that moving water through space to the water within biological tissue. Metal bending takes earth bending to the outer limit of its perceptive sensitivity. Lightning bending is fire bending with all turbulence removed, fire disciplined to the point of achieving a different quality entirely. Lightning redirection, the technique Iroh invented by studying waterbending, is the cross-disciplinary application of the waterbending principle that force can be redirected rather than opposed, applied to a form of energy that is not water but behaves analogously when approached with the right philosophy. And energy bending is the oldest form of all, predating the 4 elemental disciplines, the root from which all of them eventually grew. The Lycaon Erdl scene in the Book 3 finale is the most debated instance of a story element that appears, to many viewers, to arrive without sufficient preparation. Aang's central ethical crisis, the question of whether he can or will kill Ozai, has been building for the entire final season. He has grappled with it in conversations with his past lives, with the rest of the team, in dreams and visions. The answer that arrives, that energy bending allows him to take Ozai's firebending rather than his life, resolves the crisis in a way that is philosophically consistent with everything Aang is, while being delivered by a creature that had not been prominent in the story. The foreshadowing exists. In Book 2, Episode 10, The Library, a brief shot of a scroll depicting a lion turtle appears. In Book 3, during the Day of Black Sun episodes, a carving of a lion turtle is visible on a wall in the Fire Nation's underground bunker. These appearances last only seconds. They are easy to miss. But they are there, deliberately placed, establishing the creature in the show's mythology before it becomes plot relevant. The creators have confirmed they were intentional foreshadowing. The development of energy bending as a concept required the production team to think backward through the Avatar world's established spiritual history, to ask what the 4 bending disciplines must originally have descended from. If bending is a relationship between a person's life force and an element's essential nature, what is the most fundamental expression of that relationship? What is bending at its most primordial level, before it differentiated into water and earth and fire and air? The answer the show arrives at is bending the energy itself, the animating force underlying all other bending. This is consistent with the established spiritual framework. It is a reaching toward the oldest rule, the one all the others derived from. But it required time and creative excavation to arrive at, and the lion turtle as its delivery mechanism required careful advance placement to function as something other than convenience dropped into the story at the moment of maximum need. The bending system of Avatar was discovered across 3 seasons by writers and animators who kept asking the next question after each answer. Metal bending and blood bending and energy bending and lightning redirection are not additions to the world. They are the world becoming more fully known to itself. And the process of that discovery, the conversations where someone realized that metal contains earth impurities and earthbending works through seismic sensitivity, the conversation where someone traced the line from plant bending to blood bending, is itself a story. One that ran parallel to the story on screen but that most viewers never had access to. Part 9. The finale, they rebuilt 4 parts from 3, and everything added to hold it together. The series finale of Avatar, The Last Airbender, was planned as 3 parts. It became 4. The expansion happened because the 3-part version was running long in a way that trimming it would damage. Not padding that could be removed without loss, but essential material, scenes that gave the characters space before the final confrontation, emotional beats that had been earned across 3 seasons, and needed time to land properly. The choice was to compress or to ask for more. The production team went to Nickelodeon and argued for a 4th episode, requesting that the finale be given the space it needed to function as the conclusion to 3 years of story, rather than being squeezed into whatever a standard 3-part runtime allowed. Nickelodeon agreed. The finale aired on the 19th of July, 2008, in 4 parts titled collectively Sozin's Comet, with a combined runtime of approximately 92 minutes. It was one of the longest animated series finales produced for American network television at that point in the medium's history, and the decision to produce it that way was a deliberate choice to give the story what it needed, rather than what the format technically permitted. The additional episode was not simply an extension of the existing plan. It required new material, scenes written specifically to justify and fill the expanded runtime. This means that some of what is most beloved in the finale, specific moments that feel like essential parts of the story rather than additions, are there because the finale grew beyond its original shape and needed to be developed to fit its new dimensions. The largest excision from the finale is the Ursa scene, discussed earlier, drawn and then removed. But the editing process for the 4 parts was extensive, involving multiple passes at the pacing of each section. The creators were specifically committed to making the final Agni Kai between Zuko and Azula feel different from any other fight in the series. The camera distance, the music, the pacing. All of it went through multiple iterations before arriving at what aired, in service of a specific intention. This fight should feel like a funeral for the relationship between these 2 siblings, not like a victory. The decision to let the finale run to 4 parts rather than 3 was characteristic of a production that had spent 3 seasons arguing for the space it needed. One more argument, one more request. And the network, by this point aware of what it had, said yes. Part 10. Azula in the comics and the shape of what survived. Great stories leave behind a particular quality when they end. The sense that the world they built continues to exist somewhere, inhabited by people whose lives did not stop when the screen went dark. Avatar has this quality in a particularly intense degree. Part of what gives it that feeling is precisely the incompleteness of certain threads, the questions raised and not answered, the characters whose trajectories feel unresolved in ways that are deliberate rather than accidental. After the finale, the canon continuation moved into graphic novels, most significantly, the Search trilogy, written by Jean Luen Yang. Azula's trajectory in the comics does not follow Ihaz's vision for a potential 4th season. Instead, the comics depict someone still fragile, still dangerous, still not at peace with what she is or what was done to her or what she did. The comics do not resolve her arc because the arc, in any honest telling, is not the kind of thing that resolves in a few graphic novel issues. The damage done to Azula across her childhood is the damage of someone who was told she was perfect by a person who was incapable of love, who was given power as a substitute for warmth, who learned to see other people primarily as variables in a system she was trying to control. That damage does not undo itself in a season. It is the work of a lifetime, if it can be undone at all. What the comics give her is presence, proof that she survived. Continued engagement with her story by creators who cared about the characters and understood what had been built. For many fans, this arrived as both gift and limitation. Gift because the questions the animated show left open were engaged with seriously. Limitation because the specific vision Ihaz described, where Zuko becomes for Azula what Iroh was for him, where repair is attempted with patience that does not require the other person to deserve it yet, did not find its form in those pages. It lives instead in the description Ahaz gave of it, public and felt, years after the show had ended. It lives in the specific way he phrased it, as something he intended, as a regret, as a story he believed in. And it lives in the trajectory of the Agni Kai, which was filmed with so much deliberate care that it feels designed to leave a question open rather than seal it shut. The door was left open, not by accident. Part 11. The personal losses, Mako, voices, and the things that cannot be recovered. There is a category of loss in Avatar's history that does not fit neatly into cancelled seasons or creative negotiations. It is the loss that is personal, that involves not just decisions but the lives of the people who made the show. Mako Iwamatsu, who voiced Iroh across books 1 and 2, died of esophageal cancer on the 21st of July 2006. He was 72 years old. He was a pioneering Japanese-American actor whose career spanned decades across film and television, known for a quality of stillness and dignity that made even small roles feel significant. His work as Iroh is one of the most affecting voice performances in American animation. What he brought to the role is not reducible to any single technique. It is a quality of presence, of warmth that sounds lived in rather than performed, the warmth of someone who has actually made the long journey from ambition through grief to peace, and carries the evidence of each stage in the specific texture of how he speaks. When Iroh tells Zuko that he is proud of him, the weight of the statement is enormous. It lands like something that matters because it comes from somewhere real. The episode Tales of Ba Sing Se contains the segment in which Iroh sets up a small shrine and sings quietly in memory of his dead son, Lu Ten. The segment had been conceived as an emotionally devastating moment within an episode structured around small, quiet stories. It became something beyond that. Mako recorded the performance. He died on the 21st of July 2006. The episode aired in September 2006, approximately 2 months after his death. The dedication card at the end of the episode reads, "In honor of Mako." What is lost is everything Mako would have brought to Book 3. The role was recast with Greg Baldwin, who studied Mako's performance with evident care and produced a continuation that most viewers experience as seamless. Baldwin's performance is widely considered one of the most successful voice actor transitions in animation history. The warmth persists. The character is continuous. But what Mako would have done with the White Lotus liberation of Ba Sing Se, with Iroh facing Zuko after years of separation, with every specific moment in Book 3 that required the character to be fully himself, is the loss that cannot be documented. It exists entirely as the hypothetical of what might have been, which is the only kind of loss that cannot be measured. There are smaller losses elsewhere. The Boulder, the character in Book 2 who is an explicit parody of Dwayne Johnson, was originally approached with Johnson himself as the potential voice. The casting did not work out. Johnson has since expressed genuine affection for the show and the character, but the version of that episode with his actual voice behind a parody of his own persona is a small, permanently unavailable alternative. Jeremy Zuckerman, the show's composer, produced music across 3 seasons at a pace and level of engagement that generates more than makes it into the final cut. Compositions written for scenes that were re-edited or removed, ambient pieces that lived briefly in the production pipeline and then found no home in the version that aired. The music that reached the audience is extraordinary. The music that was made and has not been heard exists somewhere, in production archives if it was preserved at all, a quiet overflow of care that the show generated and could not always contain. Part 12. What lives in the silence? There is a philosopher named Simone Weil who wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She meant that truly seeing something, giving it the full weight of your awareness, is an act of love. Not dramatic love, the quiet kind. The kind that says, simply, I see you. What I see is worth my time. The creators of Avatar, The Last Airbender, paid attention to their world with that kind of generosity. The calligraphy that most viewers cannot read, the martial art forms that most viewers cannot name, the lunar cycle tracked across an entire season so that the full moon of the Siege of the North would feel not convenient but earned, the position of a blind girl's feet when she sleeps, the arc of a teenage boy who became the girl who became the greatest earthbender in the world, the hawk that became Iroh. What the almost stories tell you is that the attention extended past the edges of what was made. The almost stories are not evidence of failure, they are evidence of abundance. A world built with enough care that even the parts left unbuilt left marks on the parts that were. Azula in chains, crying, her fire gone wild. That image carries the weight of the story planned for her because the people who planned it also made the image. The Agni Kai was filmed the way it was filmed because the production team understood what it needed to communicate and what it needed to leave open. The door was left open by people who believed something on the other side of it was worth believing in. Ursa and Zuko's question to Ozai. The question hanging in the prison cell. The storyboard sitting in a production archive, drawn by someone who loved the story enough to imagine the scene in full before someone else loved it enough to leave the question open. Iroh in Book 3, in the voice of a man who studied the performance of the man who came before him and honored it with everything he had. The continuity of warmth across a casting change that most audiences never consciously register is its own testimony to what the original performance meant and what the production was determined to preserve. And Toph. Small, blind, the greatest earthbender in the world. The joke that was not a joke. The character a network pushed against and a production fought for. The girl who was almost a boy and arrived instead as herself, which turned out to be the only thing she could have been without the story losing something essential. The lost stories are not separate from the show. They are part of the same fabric, present in the show's specific emotional texture, in the scenes that reach towards something just out of frame, in the questions the story raises and holds open, in the care visible in every decision, including the decisions not to do something. You cannot see the almost stories directly, but you feel them the way you feel the depth of still water, the weight of what is below the surface, even when the surface is all you can see. Tonight, let that depth carry you. The world was built by people who could not imagine making it any other way, by people who believed that the things you do not see matter just as much as the things you do, that the invisible architecture holds the visible world together, that the work done in rooms no audience ever entered, the arguments and the storyboards and the late-night conversations and the creative decisions that never made it to air is part of the work. It is all here, in the negative space around every scene that reaches past its own edges, in the open door of Azula's ending, in the question left hanging in the prison cell, in the space where the hawk used to be, now occupied by a person whose presence changed everything. Let your eyes close. Let the world of Avatar hold you the way well-built things always hold, not through perfection but through the depth of care put into every part, including the parts that did not survive. The calligraphy is real. The hawk became Iroh, the teenage boy became Toph, and somewhere in a production archive, there is a storyboard of a son seeing his mother again, drawn by someone who loved the story enough to imagine it fully before someone else loved it enough to leave it open. That is what the best things are made of. Not only what was completed, but everything that was given to the completing. All the care that poured into what could not fit and still shaped everything that could. Rest now. The world of Avatar will be here when you come back. Still holding more than you have yet found. Still rewarding the looking. It was built to do exactly that, and it has not stopped. If you are still here, still listening, wherever this night finds you, thank you. Drop a comment below with where you are in the world and what time it is. And if you have not subscribed yet, that one small thing genuinely keeps these long journeys going. More is coming. Rest well. Extended notes. The deeper architecture of what was almost made. There is a dimension of Avatar's almost stories that deserves more time than the main sections above gave it. The dimension that concerns not just what was cut or canceled, but why the specifics of what was cut or canceled reveal something essential about how the show understood itself and what it was trying to do. Take the unaired pilot one more time, from a different angle. The pilot was made with Tin House, a Korean animation studio, before the production found JM Animation, which would go on to animate the official series under the supervision of Konietzko and DiMartino's American team at Nickelodeon's Burbank Studios. The transition between studios is not just a logistical detail. It is part of why the pilot and the official first episode feel so different in their visual texture. JM Animation brought a quality of character acting and emotional precision to the animation that the pilot did not yet have. When DiMartino, Konietzko, and then director Dave Filoni watched the first pencil test animation from JM Animation for the official first episodes, DiMartino has described all three of them being stunned by the quality. The beautiful acting, the dynamic action, the sense that the animators understood not just what the characters were doing, but what they were feeling while they did it. That quality of understanding, of animation that does emotional work rather than just physical work, is what separates the official show from the pilot in its most fundamental way. The pilot is competent. The show is emotionally alive. The difference is in the specific capabilities of the studios involved and in the maturation of the creative team's ability to communicate what they needed. The development of the American production team at Nickelodeon Studios also deserves more attention than it usually receives. Most of the crew who eventually worked on Avatar had previously worked in the style of American sitcom animation or superhero cartoons. The visual style that Konietzko and DiMartino wanted, drawing on elements of Studio Ghibli films and the more atmospheric lighting and camera work of Japanese anime, was genuinely foreign to many of the people they were working with. Konietzko has described the art direction of Avatar as a learning process for all of them, including himself, as he worked to adapt his own illustrative sensibility to the demands of a weekly animated television series produced at scale. That learning process is visible across Book 1 if you look for it. The early episodes are good, the later episodes are better. The visual language of the show, the way it uses light and color and camera angle to do emotional work alongside the animation itself, grows more confident and more sophisticated as the season progresses. By the Siege of the North, the two-part finale, the show has found a visual register that it will sustain and develop across the next 2 seasons. The creative team that eventually assembled around the show was also unusual in its constitution. Head writer Aaron Ehaus and his then-wife Elizabeth Welch Ehaus, along with a writer's room that included people with genuine knowledge of Asian cultures, martial arts traditions, and philosophical systems, gave the show an intellectual depth that most animated series for children did not attempt and would not have been able to sustain if attempted. The show Konietzko and DiMartino pitched, and the show that was produced by the collaborative team they assembled are not the same thing. They are continuous, in the way that a river is continuous with its source. But the river becomes something different as it moves and as more water joins it. The show was shaped by every person who worked on it, and some of what was lost along the way was lost because the shape of the collaborative work did not always accommodate every idea that any single person brought. The geography of the lost, every character who did not become what they almost were. It is worth spending time specifically with the characters whose almost identities illuminate something about the show's values and priorities. Zuko without Iroh. Zuko's character arc is the most celebrated element of Avatar among critics and scholars of animation. It is frequently cited as one of the finest examples of long-form character development in any medium, not just animation. The specificity of his journey from a character who seems like a straightforward antagonist, a face-scarred prince pursuing the avatar for approval he was taught to need, to a character who eventually becomes one of the story's moral centers, is built on hundreds of small decisions accumulated across 3 seasons. But almost none of those decisions would have been available in the same way if Iroh had not been present. The hawk that traveled with Zuko in the pilot could not have been the witness to Zuko's worst moments that Iroh is. Iroh's presence in every scene where Zuko makes a wrong choice is what keeps the wrong choices from defining Zuko permanently. Iroh sees what Zuko is becoming and what he could become instead, and he stays. He does not go anywhere. He is not strategic about his loyalty. He is simply there, consistently and without conditions. And the consistency of his presence is eventually what makes it possible for Zuko to imagine a different version of himself. Without Iroh, Zuko's arc would require a completely different scaffolding, a different set of relationships, a different mechanism by which the possibility of change is introduced and maintained across 3 seasons of a character who keeps choosing wrong. The show might have found another way, but it would have been a fundamentally different show. The specific warmth of the Iroh-Zuko dynamic, which is the emotional core around which so much of the series' meaning accumulates, would not exist. And what exists in its place is a messenger hawk that delivers messages. The distance between those 2 things is the distance between a great show and an adequate one. Katara named Kia. The renaming of Katara is one of the smaller changes between pilot and series, but the fact that the name was changed at all is significant. It suggests a production that was deeply attentive to the specific feel of its characters' identities, attentive to the way a name can suggest something about a person before they have done anything, the way a name can be right or slightly off in ways that are difficult to articulate but immediately felt. Katara is a name that sounds like what she does. It sounds like water moving precisely. It sounds like the specific quality of waterbending that her style embodies at its best, the kind that redirects and heals and sustains rather than overwhelming. It suits the specific combination of fierce compassion and precise power that defines her across 3 seasons. Kaya does not carry those particular resonances. It is not wrong. It is simply not as right. The production's willingness to rename a major character between the pilot and the series is evidence of the same attentiveness that produced real Chinese calligraphy in the background of every scene. The details were not arbitrary. The names were not arbitrary. Everything was done with the awareness that the specific texture of each choice accumulates into the texture of the whole. Toph as a teenage boy and romantic foil. One of the less discussed implications of the original male Toph concept is what it would have done to the group dynamics of Team Avatar. The love triangle between Aang, Katara, and a teenage boy earthbending teacher would have been a fundamentally different kind of story than what the show eventually told. The Aang-Katara relationship in the Finnish series is not a conventional romance arc. It is something slower and more grounded, developed across 3 seasons through the accumulation of small moments of trust and mutual vulnerability, rather than through dramatic declarations or romantic competition. Adding a rival into that dynamic, a charismatic teenage boy competing with Aang for Katara's attention, would have introduced a different kind of energy into the group. Not necessarily worse, but different. More conventionally driven by romantic stakes. Less interested in the specific way that Aang and Katara's relationship grows through shared experience of hardship and fear and grief. The romantic triangle is a well-used device for a reason. It creates clear, readable, dramatic tension. But it can also crowd out the quieter, more specific kind of character development that the finished show achieved. Toph as a blind girl has no romantic role in the group dynamic. She is not in competition with anyone for anyone. Her relationship with the rest of the team is not organized around romantic stakes at all. It is organized around respect, which is harder to earn than affection and more durable once earned. The process by which Toph earns the group's respect, and the process by which the group earns hers, is one of the most satisfying character relationship arcs in the series, precisely because it is not organized around romance or rivalry. It is organized around the slow, genuine recognition of what each person is capable of and what they genuinely are. That arc would not have been possible if Toph had been the teenage boy in a love triangle. The love triangle would have organized the character around a different kind of story. The boy who became the girl who became Toph. The arc of that transformation, the specific creative decisions that produced her, is itself a small story about what the show was trying to do. Avatar was consistently more interested in the unexpected configuration than the expected one. More interested in the blind girl than the athletic boy. More interested in the sister than the brother as the ultimate antagonist. More interested in the uncle than the parent as the emotional center of the show's most important character arc. The unexpected configuration, in every case, produced something more specific and more alive than the expected one would have. The sound of what was lost. Music, silence, and the emotional architecture of absence. Jeremy Zuckerman's score for Avatar, The Last Airbender, is one of the most discussed elements of the show in its own right. The decision to create distinct musical identities for each nation, built on the instruments and melodic traditions of the real-world cultures those nations were modeled on, was itself an act of extraordinary specificity. The Water Tribe themes draw on woodwinds and drumming associated with Inuit and Arctic indigenous music. The Earth Kingdom's themes use instruments from Chinese classical traditions. The Fire Nation is scored with taiko drums and brass. The Air Nomads, present only in flashbacks and the rare spiritual moment, are scored with Tibetan singing bowls and bamboo flutes. And the Avatar state, when Aang enters it, is underscored with all 4 musical palettes converging into a single dissonant chord. The music tells you that all 4 nations are present in one body. The score that made it into the show is extraordinary. But a composer working across 3 seasons of weekly television produces more music than survives the editing process. Scenes that were restructured required their score to be restructured or replaced. Moments that were cut took their music with them. Sequences that were re-edited found that the score written for the original pacing no longer worked for the new one. Zuckerman has not given extensive public detail about what was written and did not survive. But the general principle applies. The music the audience knows is the music that survived a production process that generated substantially more. The themes that were discarded because the scenes they were written for were cut, or because the emotional tone of a scene shifted between the time the score was written and the time the episode was finalized, or simply because the production ran out of time to record them in the quality the show demanded, are part of the ambient archive of Avatar's almost sounds. The most significant musical moment in the show that involves loss is also the most specifically personal. Leaves from the Vine, The song Iroh sings in the Tales of Ba Sing Se segment was one of the last recordings Mako Iwamatsu completed before his death. The song is simple, its melody is gentle. Its lyrics are about falling, about things that fall and return and eventually do not return. It is a song that a grieving father sings at the shrine of his dead son, and the performance carries the specific quality of a person who has actually lived with grief for long enough to have arrived, through it, at something that resembles peace without pretending that the grief is gone. When Mako died in July 2006 and the episode aired 2 months later, the song became something it was not originally designed to be. It became a record, not just of a character's grief, but of a performer's final performance, preserved at the end of a specific episode of a children's cartoon on a network that had given him an unusually significant role late in his career. The dedication card at the end of the episode, in honor of Mako, turned the song into a memorial. And the specific quality of Mako's voice in that segment, the warmth and the weight of it, is now impossible to hear without the awareness of what it preserved. The music that was lost in the production process is an absence. The music that was preserved in Mako's final performance is a kind of presence that exceeds what was intended. Both are part of the show's sonic history. The ending that was almost not the ending. Book 2's cliffhanger and the stakes of cancellation. The end of Book 2 is one of the most daring choices in Avatar's entire run. Aang dies. Not ambiguously. Not off-screen with Toph confirming it through seismic sense. In the crystal caverns beneath Ba Sing Se, struck by Azula's lightning while in the Avatar state, Aang is dead. Katara's spirit water, carried since the Siege of the North as a gift from the Painted Lady's spirit oasis, revives him. But there is a sustained period in the episode where the protagonist of the show is dead. This choice, which required the production to have the confidence that there would be a Book 3 to resolve the cliffhanger, was made under conditions of genuine uncertainty. As Ihas has described, the show was technically cancelled between Books 2 and 3. The decision to end Book 2 with Aang dead and Zuko having made the worst choice of his arc was made by a production team that did not know for certain they would be allowed to resolve it. Had the cancellation held Avatar, The Last Airbender would have ended with Aang dead, Ba Sing Se fallen, Zuko having sided with Azula, and the war apparently lost. This would have been one of the most abrupt and devastating endings in the history of American animation. Not as a deliberate artistic choice, but as the result of institutional indecision cutting off a story mid-breath. The people who made that ending, the writers and animators and directors who committed to leaving the story in that dark place, did so knowing this was a possibility. They trusted that the story they were building was strong enough to justify the risk. They trusted that the network would eventually make the right decision. They trusted that leaving the story in genuine darkness at the end of Book 2 was more honest and more respectful of the audience than softening the ending to something more easily closed if cancellation came. They were right to trust all of those things, but the fact that they had to trust them, that the continuation was not guaranteed, that the devastating cliffhanger could have been the permanent end, is part of the history of how Avatar was made. The Book 3 that was eventually produced to resolve those cliffhangers carries the mark of their having been real. The urgency with which Book 3 moves, the compression of what might otherwise have been slower, more textured storytelling, is the urgency of a production that had learned not to take continuation for granted. They got a finish, but the getting was not certain. And what they built in the conditions of that uncertainty is what you have. The story the finale couldn't quite tell, everything left in the air when the credits rolled. The finale of Avatar, The Last Airbender resolves what it needs to resolve. Ozai is defeated, Ba Sing Se is liberated, Zuko becomes Fire Lord, Aang and Katara kiss on a balcony at sunset while the camera slowly pulls back to give them, and the audience, the distance that comes at the end of a long journey. But there are things the finale does not resolve, things it does not close. Ursa's question, left hanging in the prison cell. Azula, in chains, her story open. The long-term consequences of a 100-year war on 4 nations that will need generations to recover. The political reality of a new Fire Lord who is 17 years old, trying to govern an empire that was built on a century of conquest, while simultaneously dismantling the ideology that maintained it. These open threads are not failures. In most cases, they are deliberate. DiMartino and Konietzko have spoken about the decision to end the show on a note of earned peace rather than exhaustive resolution, to trust that the audience could live with the unanswered questions, because the answered questions were sufficient. The show ends on joy. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth feeling good about, and the clear-eyed understanding that the difficulty will continue and that the people who faced it are capable of continuing to face it. This is a mature ending. It is the ending of people who understood that closure is not the same as resolution, and that good endings give you enough to rest on without pretending that everything hard has been resolved. But the things left open are real, and they left real marks on the people who watched them. The Ursa question generated a passionate, sustained fan response across the years, between the finale and the search. The question of Azula's ultimate trajectory generated discussion that continues to this day, informed by Ihaz's description of what the fourth season might have held. The graphic novels, the ongoing animated projects, the live-action series, all of them are evidence of a world that generated more story than its original container could hold. And all of that evidence is also evidence of the almost stories. The ones that existed in outline and description, the ones that were storyboarded and pulled, the ones that were discussed in rooms that no audience ever entered, by people who cared enough about the story to imagine further than the show was able to go. Those stories are not gone. They exist in the specific shapes of what the show left open, in the exact texture of the questions it chose not to answer, in the care with which the unanswered questions were framed so that they could be held rather than forgotten. The gift of the unfinished. Why what was almost made matters as much as what was made. There is a way of thinking about creative work that regards incompleteness as failure. The thing that was not finished, the story that was not told, the scene that was storyboarded and then removed, the season that was outlined and not produced. These are all losses, in this way of thinking. Absences where something should be. But there is another way of thinking about it. The almost stories of Avatar, The Last Airbender, are not just the record of what was lost. They are the record of care. They are the evidence that the people who made this show were invested in it deeply enough to imagine further than they were able to produce, to plan further than the resources and time and institutional permission allowed, to hold possibilities in mind that they could not always turn into episodes. The hawk that became Iroh is the record of a production that understood, at some specific point in its development, what the character of Zuko actually needed. It did not start with that understanding. It found it. The finding required the almost hawk to exist first, to be proposed and considered, and then replaced by a person whose presence changed everything. The teenage boy who became Toph is the record of a production that was willing to be wrong and then correct itself. That could be argued out of a settled position by a better idea. That took a joke seriously because the joke turned out to be the right answer. The fight with the network to keep Toph as a blind girl is the record of a production that knew what it had made and was willing to argue for it. The storyboarded scene of Ursa and Zuko is the record of a production that loved its own story enough to draw a scene it ultimately decided not to use, that imagined the reunion in enough detail to render it before concluding that rendering it would do it less justice than leaving it open. The fourth season, outlined by Ihaz, is the record of a head writer who was not done with the characters when the show was done with them, who still had things he wanted to say, who imagined the next chapter of Azula's story with enough specificity and enough feeling that he was still describing it in public a decade after the fact. None of this is failure. All of it is the mark of something that was cared about more than it was required to be, that generated more thought and feeling than it could contain, that left behind in its almost stories the evidence of how deeply it was imagined. You feel all of it in the show, not as specific knowledge, but as texture. The show feels deeper than its runtime because it is deeper, because the world it sits inside was imagined past the edges of what could be shown. The almost stories are the depth. They are the reason the still water looks still, but weighs what it weighs. Tonight, that is what you are sleeping inside. The depth of a world that was imagined further than it could be filmed, loved past the edges of what could be shown, cared for by people who could not imagine doing it any other way. Let the depth hold you. The hawk became Iroh. The boy became Toph. The storyboard became an open question. The almost season became a description full of feeling, posted on the internet a decade after the show ended by someone who still thought about the characters and believed their story was not finished. All of it is here. Rest now. The wider world of almost. Secondary characters and their unrealized depths. Beyond the central cast, there are secondary characters in Avatar whose stories gesture toward unrealized depth in ways that reward attention. Jet's freedom fighters, as a group, are one of the most compressed of the show's storytelling opportunities. Jet himself receives a genuine arc across 2 books. A first appearance in Book 1 where his charisma and his damage are both visible, a return in Book 2 where the damage has consequences that cost him his life. But the characters around him, Smellerbee and Longshot, and the others who travel with him, exist mostly as a collective presence, rather than as individuals with their own trajectories. The show has enough material established about them to suggest what a deeper exploration might have looked like. Smellerbee's gender, for instance, is the subject of a memorable exchange in Book 2 where Iroh mistakes her for a boy, and she corrects him with a combination of pride and hurt that communicates an entire interior life in a few seconds. The show notes her identity and then moves on. A longer engagement with her story, with what it means to be a girl who has grown up defined by a warrior role in a group of young rebels, would have been rich material. The show did not have time for it. Longshot, who never speaks on screen in the animated series, is a character whose entire personality is communicated through action and silence. He stays beside Smellerbee. He fires his arrows with preternatural precision at exactly the right moments. His care for the people around him is expressed entirely through what he does and never through what he says. The show handles this character with real economy, making him feel complete within a very small amount of screen time, but the question of what his silence means and what it contains is one that the show raises and does not answer. The comics that continued the canon after the show ended have given some of these secondary characters more space. But the animated version of their stories, the version with Zach Tyler Eisen and Mae Whitman and Dante Basco giving voice to the world's textures, is not there. Then there is Mai. Mai, in the show that aired, is a character defined by her characteristic flat affect, her boredom, her sardonic relationship to the world around her, and then, when the moment counts, a sudden and specific bravery that surprises everyone, including possibly herself. The Boiling Rock episode, in which she turns against Azula to let Zuko and the others escape, is one of the show's most effective character moments, precisely because the setup for it is so long and so quiet and so consistent. Mai has been performing boredom across her entire screen time, and then in one moment she stops performing, and you see what was underneath the performance all along. But her life after the Boiling Rock, after betraying Azula and being imprisoned, is handled almost entirely off-screen. She was presumably freed when Zuko became Fire Lord. She and Zuko, whose relationship had been developing quietly throughout Book 3, presumably reconnect. The comics address some of this. The animated show does not. Ty Lee, who also betrays Azula at the Boiling Rock, receives an interesting character moment in the finale's aftermath. She joins the Kyoshi Warriors. The acrobat who had been helping Azula track Team Avatar across an entire season finds a home with the group whose style she had taken from them by defeating them. It is a satisfying piece of visual storytelling, a few seconds of animation that communicates an entire new chapter without words. But the story of how Ty Lee makes that transition, what she makes of the choice she made at the Boiling Rock, what it costs her and what it gives her, is not shown. The animation of her in Kyoshi Warrior face paint is the destination without the journey. These are the stories that exist between the episodes, in the spaces where the camera was not pointed. Some of them have been addressed in comics and other ancillary material. Many of them have not. They exist as outlines visible in the specific choices the animated show made about what to show and what to imply, and the specificity of those choices is itself a form of storytelling. The Lost Geography. Locations that were gestured toward and never visited. The world of Avatar. The Last Airbender is larger than the camera visits. The show's 3 seasons take the group across a significant portion of the map, from the Southern Water Tribe to the Northern Water Tribe to the Earth Kingdom's vast interior to the Fire Nation's archipelago. But the map suggests more territory than the show has time to explore. The Eastern Air Temple appears in the show primarily in Aang's vision of Guru Patik, who teaches him about the chakra system. The temple itself is glimpsed but not explored in any depth comparable to the Southern Air Temple of Book 1. The Western Air Temple becomes a temporary sanctuary for Team Avatar in Book 3, and the show gives it genuine character, its upside-down architecture built into a cliff face, its quality of a place that was designed for airbenders and now functions as a reminder of their absence. But the other 2 air temples, the Northern and the Eastern, remain largely atmospheric, visited briefly, and never fully inhabited by the story. This matters because the air temples are among the most emotionally charged locations in Avatar's world. They are the evidence of the genocide. They are the places where Aang's people lived and were killed. Each one is a monument to an absence, and the show understood this deeply for the Southern Air Temple but had less time to explore it for the others. The Foggy Swamp, visited in Book 2, introduced the water tribe that bends the moisture inside plants and established one of the most interesting peripheral communities in the entire series. A tribe that believes the entire swamp is one living organism, connected by a shared root system, practicing a form of water bending that the show never names, but that is the conceptual predecessor to the blood bending introduced later in the same season. Their philosophy is one of the most radical in the show. The swamp is alive, we are part of it, everything is connected to everything else. The show gives them one episode and moves on. The Siwang Desert, through which the group travels in Book 2, is established as an extreme and hostile environment inhabited by the Sandbenders, a desert-adapted culture of earthbenders who travel in modified sand-sailing vessels and have developed a unique variant of earthbending suited to their environment. The Sand People have their own history, their own rivalries, their own political structure. The episode in which Team Avatar crosses the desert reveals just enough of this to make the world feel inhabited while using the location primarily to drive the plot forward and explore Appa's abduction. These peripheral cultures and locations are among the most tantalizing almost stories in Avatar's world because they suggest a depth of civilization and history that extends far beyond the central narrative's reach. The show builds a world that clearly exists in all its regions and cultures and local variations, and then shows the audience the fraction of it that the plot requires to pass through. The fraction is extraordinary, but the existence of the remainder, visible only in gestures and implications, is part of what makes the world feel so genuinely large. What stories lived in the Foggy Swamp when Team Avatar was not there? What is the history of the air temples that Aang never got to explore? What happened in the Siwang Desert before and after the group passed through? These questions are not failures of the show. They are the show's gift. A world built fully enough that the questions are real questions, rather than the sense that the territory simply does not exist. How the almost stories shape how you watch. There is a specific experience available to people who know the history of what Avatar almost was, that is different from the experience of watching without that knowledge. It is not a better experience necessarily. The show works without the context. It was designed to work without the context. The care it contains does not require the viewer to know the history of the creative decisions that produced it, but the knowledge changes the texture of what you see. When you watch the unaired pilot and then watch the official first episode, the specific improvements are not abstract. You can see exactly what was gained when Katara became Katara, and Iroh replaced the Hawk, and Zach Tyler Eisen replaced Mitchell Musso, and the opening sequence found its ceremonial quality. You can see the distance between the prototype and the finished thing. And that distance makes the finished thing feel more like something that was chosen, rather than something that happened automatically. When you watch the Agni Kai between Zuko and Azula in the finale, knowing that Ahas described a version of the story where Zuko eventually becomes for Azula what Iroh was for him, the scene acquires an additional layer. You are watching the departure point for a journey that was planned but not taken. The door that was left open deliberately. The crying was designed to be the beginning of something that the show did not have time or resources or perhaps institutional permission to tell. The specific tragedy of the scene is not just Azula's breakdown. It is also the outline of the road not walked, visible in the specific way the show chose to frame her at the end. When you watch Iroh in Book 3, knowing that the voice has changed, and knowing something of what was lost when Mako died, the performance has a different quality. You are hearing two performances simultaneously. The one that Greg Baldwin is giving, careful and warm and faithful, and the memory of the one he is faithfully preserving. It is not a diminished experience. It is a doubled one. The presence and the tribute to the presence, woven together in a way that holds both. And when you watch Toph, knowing that she was almost a teenage boy in a love triangle, knowing that her existence in the form she took required a fight that the production was willing to have and win, the specific way she carries herself, the stubbornness and the bluntness and the refusal to perform approachability for anyone's comfort, acquires another dimension. She is exactly herself in part because exactly herself was exactly what the production was willing to argue for. The almost stories do not replace the show. They surround it. They are the context in which the choices become visible as choices rather than inevitabilities. The audience that grew up, why these stories still matter 20 years later. Avatar, The Last Airbender premiered on the 21st of February, 2005. The children who watched it that first Saturday on Nickelodeon are now in their late 20s and early 30s. They grew up. They went to college. They started careers. Some of them had children of their own. And many of them came back to Avatar, not because they had been away from it exactly, but because the show had more to offer once they arrived at different places in their lives. This is the show's most quietly extraordinary quality, not just that it was good when it aired, but that it keeps being good in different ways as the people who watch it change. The 6-year-old who watched Avatar in 2005 was watching an adventure story about a boy who could fly. The 16-year-old who rewatched it was watching a story about family and obligation and the specific pain of becoming someone your parents did not intend. The 26-year-old who rewatched it again was watching a story about the slow, difficult process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you were told to be. The 36-year-old is watching all of those stories at once, and underneath them something that has no easy name. The quality of a world that was loved into existence by the people who made it, a love that is still palpable, and that still reaches across the years to the person watching. The almost stories are part of this sustained relevance. The person who discovers at 26 that the character they love most in the show was almost a teenage boy in a love triangle, or that the head writer of the show described an entire 4th season arc that was never made, is receiving something that changes not just their understanding of the show, but their relationship to it. The show becomes a place where more happened than was shown, where there are rooms the camera never entered that were still designed, where people cared about the characters past the edges of the final credits. This is the gift of the almost stories, not just as historical information but as an experience of care. Someone thought about Azula past the end of the show. Someone drew the reunion of Ursa and Zuko before deciding it should be left open. Someone argued, in a room at Nickelodeon Studios in Burbank, that a small blind girl should be the most powerful earthbender in the world, and kept arguing until the argument was won. The caring is in the show, and the caring is in the almost stories. And both of them reach the audience, in different ways, at different times in their lives, and both of them leave the same impression. This was made by people who meant it. That is the final almost story, not a canceled season or a storyboarded scene or a character who nearly had a different name, but the near miss of a show that was almost not as extraordinary as it became, held back by institutional uncertainty and creative fights not yet won and early designs not yet fully right. And the arrival, through all of those almost losses, at something that has proven durable enough to carry people towards sleep 20 years later. The world that almost wasn't became the world that is, and the world that is still here, still waiting, still holding more than you have yet found. If you made it all the way here, thank you, genuinely. The fact that you are still listening, still here, at whatever hour this finds you, means something real. If you have not subscribed yet, that one small thing genuinely keeps these long journeys going. Drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. There is something I love about knowing how many different quiet places in the world are letting the same story carry them to sleep at the same moment. More of this is coming. Rest well. The last room in the archive. What the almost stories tell you about the real ones. There is one more way to understand what the almost stories of Avatar mean, and it requires stepping back far enough to see the whole shape of them together. Every canceled arc, every pulled scene, every character who started as someone else before becoming who they are, every season that was outlined and not produced, every episode that exists only in a writer's description posted online years after the show ended, shares a common quality. They are all evidence that the people who made Avatar were thinking past what they could make. They were imagining a world that was larger than any broadcast schedule could contain, larger than any network budget could accommodate, larger than 3 seasons of a children's animated series could hold even at the extraordinary level of craft that those 3 seasons achieved. This matters because it changes how you understand the show that does exist. When you know that Ihas imagined a 4th season in enough detail to describe specific character arcs in specific terms, Azula's arc, Iroh's arc, the spiritual deepening that would have followed the political resolution of Book 3, you understand that the ending the show gives you is not the ending of the story. It is the ending of what could be shown. The world continued past the final frame. The characters continued past the credits. The story was larger than its container from the beginning, and the people who made it knew this, And they made the container as good as it could possibly be while understanding that the contents would always slightly exceed it. This is what great world building does. It makes you feel the presence of what is not shown. You feel the weight of the history that predates the episodes, the culture that exists in the background of the action, the lives being lived in every city the group passes through. You feel the future the characters are moving toward even when the show does not show you that future. The weight is real because someone put it there. Someone thought about it, outlined it, argued about it in rooms, drew pieces of it and filed them away. The weight is the almost stories, and the almost stories are what the real stories are built on. The hawk became Iroh. This is the foundational almost story of Avatar, the one that contains all the others. A messenger hawk traveling with a prince on a ship is a fine detail. It is functional. It communicates something about the world, but it does not change the story. It does not provide the specific quality of witness that makes Zuko's wrong choices bearable to watch, that keeps the possibility of a different version of him alive across 2 seasons of evidence to the contrary, that produces the reunion in Book 3 that stands as one of the most emotionally complete moments in the show's entire run. The hawk is a detail. Iroh is a reason to believe that the person you are watching, the scarred prince who keeps making the wrong choice, is worth watching. A reason to believe that the capacity for change is real, that it persists even when every action argues against it, that someone who has always known what you could become does not stop knowing that even when you seem determined to prove them wrong. That transformation, from detail to reason, is what the almost stories reveal about the real stories. Every single right choice in Avatar's finished form is visible as a choice precisely because the almost version exists. The almost hawk shows you what a messenger can and cannot do. The finished Iroh shows you what a witness can do. The distance between them is the distance between a good show and the one that actually exists. So when you fall asleep tonight, inside the world of Avatar, inside the quiet architecture of what was built with extraordinary care by people who cared more than they were required to, let that distance be part of what carries you. Not just the show as it is, but the show as it almost was, and the specific quality of attention that the distance between the two required. Someone decided the hawk was not enough. Someone decided the blind girl was right. Someone drew a reunion scene and then decided the open question was richer than the answer. Someone described a 4th season's worth of story a decade after the fact because the characters were still alive enough in his imagination to have somewhere to go. All of that caring is in the show. It is the show's foundation. It is what the calligraphy is real for, what the lunar cycle is tracked for, what the martial arts are choreographed for. Not so that you will notice, so that you will feel without knowing why, that the world has weight, that the weight is real, that someone was here before you, building in the dark, putting care into places the camera would never point. Rest now. The world is built, it will hold you.